You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the Spectator's economics correspondent Kate Andrews. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Telegraph says the Prime Minister is planning to give tenants the right to buy the homes they rent from housing associations at a discounting price in an attempt to alleviate the pressures on generation rent. The Daily Mail calls on Sir Keir Starmer to provide proof he didn't break lockdown rules himself during an event where he allegedly drank beer with Labour activists in September of 2020. The Financial Times says Chinese regulators have held emergency meetings with banks to assess how to protect Chinese assets from sanctions imposed by the United States on Russia. Meanwhile, The Guardian reports that thousands of dentists quitting their jobs and dental practices closing and going private has led to millions being left without access to dental care. And The Express says a record 2.7 million people joined the backlog for cancer care and diagnosis during the COVID pandemic. And finally, the Daily Star has a story about the dangers dogs may face ahead of the hot weather this summer, with vets urging owners to rub sun cream on their dogs. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Zoe Williams and Kate Andrews. Welcome to you both. Let's start with The Guardian, your paper, Zoe, and this story on the front page, headline there, Bad Apples Claim Fuels Parliament Sexism Row. Kate, I'll get you to start us off with this one.
So as The Guardian's reporting, and as we've heard for weeks now, accusation after accusation is coming in against a culture of sleaze in Westminster. Pestminster, as it's been dubbed to the past, feels like it's coming back. And The Guardian is reporting that the government is facing intense pressure, that it takes more action over the misogyny and harassment, in quotes here, after a senior minister denied institutional problems, saying that there were simply some bad apples. I think one of the difficulties here is that it is very difficult when we start to generalize. Terms like Pestminster suggest that everybody is caught up in this. And of course, there are many, many good people working across Whitehall. But like in every industry and every institution, you're going to come across people who abuse their power and manipulate those who are more junior to them. I think the difficulty in Westminster is that a lot of these accusations haven't been taken as seriously in the past as they should have been. Calls for HR are never properly brought in. The structures are unclear. And it does seem that people who are in the most powerful positions feel sometimes inclined to abuse that power. And so when people say, well, it's just some bad apples, it doesn't go down well, because whilst of course it isn't everybody who's taking part in a sleaze culture, if these issues have been raised in the past and not properly addressed, it certainly doesn't feel like this is just a one-off case. It feels like there's a systematic problem here that needs to be tackled. And for a government that has now been in charge for well over a decade, to be acting, for anybody in that government to be acting as if this isn't their responsibility to seriously look into this and fix those institutional problems, there's going to be pushback to that.
Well, certainly Labour are warning of a toxic culture, aren't they, Zoe?
Listen, I have to take issue with something that Kate just said. This is not every workplace, you know. I mean, I obviously I haven't worked in every workplace, but if you consider the facts here, you had Stella Creasy on the one hand, lobbying to be able to bring her baby in so she could breastfeed in the House of Commons, while somebody else is watching porn in the House of Commons. I mean, that is absolutely unthinkable. There's no way that regular workplaces were going through something like this. There's no way that normal workplaces were saying, oh, well, you know, 1 in 10 MPs, 1 in 10 of our workers has some kind of sexual allegation against them, and yet this is functional. So Tracy Brabin's comments on Friday do, you know, raise salience here. It was the Wild West. It still is the Wild West in Westminster, and it is in no way comparable to any ordinary workplace. So, you know, whether you say it's a few bad apples, whether you say it's coming from the top, whether you say it's a few bad apples who weren't sufficiently dealt with. The truth is, you will not be able to solve this until you accept that it is a really, really unusual situation.
Kate, I don't think you were saying it was a few bad apples, were you?
No, I wasn't saying it was two bad apples. That's what the Guardian's report that a senior minister has suggested. I did suggest that Westminster isn't the only place where you will find people who abuse their power. And perhaps I was more optimistic than I am, and I would like to be more optimistic. But I think realistically, sector-wide, you are mostly going to find well-intentioned people who respect their staff and understand consent. I think most adults are capable of doing that. You are always going to find people who try to bend the rules, who don't respect others. And I think that you do, broadly speaking, agree with Zoe that you might find more of that in Westminster than you would in certain other sectors. But I think if you speak to women in finance, if you speak to people in the city, you'll find that people who end up in very high positions of power sometimes feel immune, like they can abuse it. And the problem with language, like it's a few bad apples, isn't that Westminster is the only place where this happens. It's certainly not. But that Westminster famously has issues with its systems and a lack of HR. This does happen in other sectors, but it's usually cracked down on very, very quickly because there are clear structures that don't tolerate this kind of thing. And men and women know exactly where they can go and what they need to do to report this behavior. This has been an issue for bullying in Westminster as well. The structures just have not been clear. And it's very rare that I call for more bureaucracy. I personally wouldn't want to work for an organization that was very HR heavy, but you need certain fundamental structures and systems in place so that women and men know where to go when power is being used against them. It's very clear for a long time that Westminster hasn't done this properly. So
I don't think this is a question of. I honestly don't think this is a question of not knowing where to go and not having systems in place. I think this is a question of absolute impunity. And it is quite serious. It's not the case that female MPs were too clueless or too ignorant or lacked the ability to go somewhere and complain. It is actually extremely weird.
Let's move on. Let's move on because we want to get some other papers in. Let's move on to the Mail. Let's move on to the Mail, and this moving on from Partygate to Beergate, and there's a call now for Sir Keir Starmer to provide some proof regarding Beergate. Take us into this, Kate.
Well, Keir Starmer is under a lot of pressure based on whatever happened in Durham in September 2020. He has been cleared. The Durham police decided that he hadn't broken lockdowns, but there is emerging evidence, increasing suggestion that something far more fun was happening around this pub quiz, and around a pub quiz that was then discovered was taking place. The front of the Mail suggests that perhaps there was a mass order of curry and takeaway involved in this evening, and people simply aren't buying the idea that this was simply a work event. Now, the difficulty here is that because we are retrospectively deciding that we're going to prosecute these fines, and we're going to have different police forces up and down the country doing so, we're going to be getting a lot of different results. And I think it's quite right that the accusations in Westminster and Number 10 in particular are taken most seriously. These are, of course, the people who were setting the rules. For them to be breaking them is the most egregious. But given the fact that very junior people are now reported to be getting fines, for the leader of the opposition to potentially escape a fine is not going to go down well either. So as more evidence emerges that perhaps a little bit too much fun was being had when it was illegal for others to be doing so, pressure is going to increase on the Labour Party, especially if they want to keep going on about Partygate. It is more difficult for the Labour Party to do that. Standing accusations.
We are running out of time, but Zoe, just come back there.
No, but let me just cut in. In September 2020, the lockdown rules weren't the same. We were already allowed to meet in completely different configurations by that time. So the idea that the Labour Party has broken the rules in the same way is completely fanciful. And Kate, I'm amazed you don't know that.
Well, nobody's saying it was the same accusation is that they
we have to take a break.
There were a lot of rules in September 2020.
We have to take a break, ladies, but just suffice to say that Sir Keir Starmer insists he was working and his team only stopped for a break for food before resuming their duties. We are going to take a break. Don't worry, we'll get more time when we come back. Coming up, foul play, blow to family budgets as cost of chicken is set to soar as high as beef. That's the headline in tomorrow's Daily Mirror. We'll be discussing that next. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. Let's have a look at the Financial Times. It's going to take us to France and their May Day protest. Traditional. Macron's hardly stepped back into position, but he's being protested against in France. Kate. Actually, no, Zoe, you bring us into this.
Well, basically, the trades union movement in France and the left in general is trying to hold Macron's feet to the fire. And they do so not just because it's International Workers' Day today, happy International Workers' Day, but because the left basically saved Macron from defeat. You know, Mélenchon's votes, even though many of them said they weren't going to vote at all, the ones that counted went to Macron rather than Le Pen. And so he did triumph on left-wing votes, basically. And now they're saying, you need to reflect the fact that our support has put you where you are. And that's something that he arguably failed to reflect in his first term.
Kate, let's take viewers to the Mirror, and this is the cost of living crisis, again, demonstrated in the fact that chicken is now going to cost as much as beef. It's soared in price.
Yes, this is the warning on the front page of the Mirror that chicken could soon cost as much as beef as supply chain issues and inflation are rearing their ugly head again. And, you know, this is once again a very difficult reality of what happens when prices start to soar. And in some ways, you know, this is an international issue. Every developed economy is dealing with quite serious inflation. But the reality for people is that it means prices going up. It means some very difficult choices for those at the lower end of the pay spectrum. And the biggest issue is that this is going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, we haven't seen the peak of inflation yet. It could be double-digit figures, and that means extremely difficult choices in the next 6 months.
Yeah, indeed. It could be the first time the price has been the same as beef for about 70 years. Kate and Zoe, thank you both for taking us through the papers. We'll see you in the next hour.